We hear a lot about free agency in women's football, and it's usually framed as opportunity, freedom, or even leverage. Players out of contract, club circling, big moves, fresh start. But free agency isn't just a moment. It's a condition players live inside for months, sometimes years. And the reality is far more complicated than the headlines may suggest. Because while free agency is supposed to give players power, it also creates uncertainty, pressure, silence, and even risk. In this video, I want to break down what free agency actually means for players, not just in theory, but in practice. How it affects performance, security, careers, and decision making, and why it's becoming one of the defining features of modern women's football. Now, what do we think free agency means? On paper, free agency sounds simple. A player's contract expires, they're free to negotiate, they choose their next move. And compared to earlier eras of women's football where players had very little bargaining power, free agency seems like progress. However, this sort of framing assumes that players have equal access to information, equal negotiating power, equal demand, or even stable financial structures. Now, this is rarely the reality. So what is the reality? Well, free agency starts way before contracts end. One of the biggest misconceptions is that free agency starts after a contract expires. In reality, it starts 6 to 18 months earlier. This is when conversations quietly start happening. Players start assessing risk, clubs begin planning contingencies, and uncertainty might begin to creep into day-to-day football life. Players may still be training, playing, starting games, but behind the scenes, they're in the process of managing contract anxiety, performance pressure, injury risk, and long-term career decisions. And crucially, they're often doing this without clarity at all. So let's explore what the psychological weight of uncertainty is. Free agency doesn't just affect contracts, it affects how players feel on the pitch. When your future is uncertain, every performance feels like much higher stakes. And mistakes feel far more costly. Not to mention injuries feel far more threatening. A knock that might normally mean rest might actually now have a player questioning whether they can afford to miss a game. And because women's football operates with shorter contracts, thinner squads, and fewer long-term guarantees, players often feel that they have less margin for error. Free agency ultimately turns football into a constant evaluation. Now let's explore why options aren't always real options. From the outside looking in, fans often assume that players always have options, but not all options are equal. A player might technically be free, but they might be constrained by geography, visas, salary caps, squad needs, playing style fits, and so much more. Some offers may exist but at a career cost, such as reduced minutes, lower visibility, less medical support, or even unstable environments. So free agency becomes less about choice and more about trade-offs. Now let's explore how injury risk changes everything. This is where free agency intersects directly with player welfare. For players nearing contract expiry, injuries are no longer just physical setbacks, but instead financial and career risks. An injury at the wrong time can reduce offers, delay negotiations, force short-term deals, or even push players into uncertainty. This is often why we see players who were injured returning earlier than ideal, playing through issues, or even hesitating to rest. Free agency doesn't just follow injury. It reshapes recovery decisions. Now let's look at why short contracts are becoming the norm. One of the quiet shifts in women's football is the rise of the one-year deals. Short extensions and rolling uncertainty. For clubs, this ultimately reduces risk. But for players, it creates almost constant free agency. Instead of stability, careers become a constant negotiation, with performance audits and repeated proof of value. And while some players may thrive in an environment like that, many may experience mental fatigue and difficulty settling. Free agency then ultimately stops being a moment and ultimately becomes the lifestyle. Now, who does free agency benefit the most? Now, here's the uncomfortable truth, which, as we know, I'm not so afraid of saying. Free agency tends to benefit established international players, players with strong representation, and players at the top of the market. So all your favorite players that you hear about in the media most days. But for squad players, rotation players, players returning from injury, and those outside major leagues, free agency means less protection, not more. And as women's football grows, that gap is becoming more visible. Now let's examine something called the performance paradox. There is a paradox at the heart of free agency. Players are told if they perform their best football, they will secure their future. But the conditions of free agency make that much harder because pressure increases, freedom decreases, and risk tolerance ultimately drops. Instead of expression, players must manage exposure. And that changes how football is played, not just by individuals, but across teams. Now, what does this mean for the game? Free agency isn't inherently bad. It is necessary and it is progress, but without longer contracts, clearer pathways, stronger welfare protections, and better calendar stability, free agency becomes a stress multiplier, not an empowerment tool. And if we want sustainable careers, not just sustainable leagues, this is something the women's game has to confront honestly. Free agency is often framed as freedom, but for many players it's uncertainty, calculation, and pressure. Understanding that doesn't make the game less exciting, it makes it more human. Let me know your thoughts about all of this in the comments, and I will see you in the next video.